Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I'm Ryan Wormeli, joined today by Pat Fitzmaurice and by our guest, Adam Pfeifer from FTN. Adam, you were just telling us before we started recording that this right here is your favorite time of year.
Yeah, I love it. And I kind of joked with you guys saying, yeah, nobody's wrong about anything yet. And while that's partially true, I just love just being able to try to make cases for players. It's just fun to find the awesome stats that really click. And it'll stay that way until about week 2, week 3, and then it looks like everything's falling apart. But right now, I love this time of year. I appreciate you guys having me on for sure.
We're definitely happy to have you on the show here. Is this your first time on the Fantasy Pros show? I know it's the first time we've met.
First time with you guys. I've been on once or twice before, but definitely first time with both of you guys. So it's very cool. Very cool to be on.
Very fun. We're really looking forward to chatting with you here today. Fitz, is this your favorite time of year as well?
Yeah, I kind of share Adam's sentiment on that about us not having gotten anything wrong yet, about this world of possibilities with all the teams that we're busy drafting this time of year, and no injuries yet. At least nothing major in training camp, some aches and pains, but nothing that is, tilting the polls one way or the other. So that's always nice.
There's absolutely nothing worse than when there is a major injury in August. And it's like you waited all offseason excited about whatever the situation that player was in. And just to right before you get to the season, have it taken away from you is about the worst feeling in fantasy. That's brutal. So thankfully not quite yet have we delved into that, but I'm sure it will come. It always does every year. It's the worst part of football. All right, let's jump into the show. We are talking about some players that are projected to have big seasons, and the way we're approaching this is we're taking players that our Fantasy Pros projections have. You can find that on the site, that they have higher than these players are going in ADP relative to their position. So we're going to go through every, guys at every position, kind of see who our projections like more than the folks that are going in ADP right now. You can find that ADP consensus on the site as well, and we'll react and see if we agree with the projections or not. Quick reminder for everyone, all of our 2024 consensus rankings and tiers can be found at fantasypros.com/rankings. A couple other quick announcements. The winner of Trophy Smack's Superstar Fantasy Football Draft Board Kit is the Shaman. Please get in touch with our customer support agents at mailbag@fantasypros.com with your mailing address and proof of your subscription to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel, and we will get that shipped out to you. Again, the winner is the Shaman. Congratulations. And if you want the chance to win a glorious fantasy football championship belt for your league, courtesy of our good friends at Trophy Smack, the #1 destination for epic fantasy football trophies, you need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Drop a comment below on any of our videos, and that's it. We will be announcing a winner right here on the channel, so make sure to turn on those notifications so you can know when new videos are up and to claim your prize. All right, guys, we will kick it off with players are in the top 50 in overall half PPR ADP. These are the studs that our projections love even more than they're currently going. And we're going to start right off with a running back, Derrick Henry. The projections that we have him as RB7. He's going as RB10 in ADP, 22nd overall. This is somebody that fits. I know you and I have talked about a lot on a number of our shows this offseason. It's no surprise to anybody that I am a huge Derrick Henry fan, both from being a Ravens fan and also just I love the setup for him this year. I'm totally on board with our projections being higher than ADP on him. Adam, I'm curious where you come in on Henry this year.
Yeah, I really like Derrick Henry. I know the consensus is to fade the 30-plus-year-old running back who's had 7,000 touches, but I just don't see a better fit. You look at the last season in Tennessee where Henry's tackle-breaking metrics were still good. It's just they weren't quite the vintage prime Derrick Henry seasons, and he was behind an awful offensive line. He averaged 1.62 yards before contact per attempt. According to FTN data, he was contacted behind the line of scrimmage 27% of the time. It was one of the highest rates among qualified players. Now you have Baltimore, which did lose some pieces. The offensive line's not quite as good, but it's still an upgrade. And with just the gravity that Lamar Jackson presents and forces on opposing defenses, you look at it since 2000, like the Ravens have had 3 of the top 30 seasons in yards before contact per attempt among running backs with at least 70 attempts, talking about like guys like Devonta Freeman and Kenyon Drake and Dobbins and Edwards. So Henry's going to take a step up in terms of efficiency, yards before contact. And then I'm sure you guys talk about just the raw touchdown potential. Gus Edwards, 19 carries inside the 5-yard line last season, led the NFL, converted them into 12 touchdowns. And finally, What's the one scenario where starting Derrick Henry in fantasy in the past has not worked out? It's been when Tennessee is down 17-3 and they're throwing the ball in the third quarter, fourth quarter. The Ravens aren't going to, it's not going to be to the last year's level. Ryan, maybe you disagree, but they're still going to be ahead in more games than not. Last season, the Ravens trailed by 8+ points for 47 plays. For reference, the next closest was San Fran with 113. So if you're giving Derrick Henry far more favorable game scripts where he can get 18 to 22 carries, and he's getting touchdown opportunities, and oh, by the way, Lamar Jackson doesn't get used inside the 5-yard line like Jalen Hurts, like Josh Allen. He only has 9 carries inside the 5 the last 2 years. I just think the efficiency in this offense is going to take a step forward, and outside of Christian McCaffrey, I don't know if I would project anybody to score as many rushing touchdowns as Derrick Henry this year.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I do not disagree that the Ravens maybe aren't going to be as dominant as they were last year. But in Lamar's career, when he's on the field, I think it's something like 4 or 5 games total that they have lost by more than one score. It just doesn't happen.
And there was that report of Justice Hill is going to be they kind of view him as a co-starter. And first of all, I didn't buy that. Second of all, that only concerns me if the Ravens are trailing. And I just don't think there's going to be many games where they're down by 2 scores. I just don't see it happening. Obviously, Justice Hill's playing on third downs more likely than not, but if they're not facing as many third downs and if they're not chasing points, then Derrick Henry is going to smash.
Yeah, you hit on this with how the Ravens like to operate when they get close to the goal line, but there was a stat that I shared on the FantasyPros Twitter account just yesterday, which is that Lamar Jackson, in terms of among quarterbacks, fantasy points scored inside the 20-yard line this year was 5th. Last year was 5th. Inside the 15-yard line was 6th. Inside the 10-yard line was 5th. Inside the 5-yard line was 25th. When they get in close, incredible. They do not run with Lamar. They like to run with the running backs. Derrick Henry could take a step back because he's 30 and still be much better than Gus Edwards. And that's no shot on Gus Edwards. Derrick Henry, it would take an outlier season to do what I think he can do at age 30, but Derrick Henry has always been an outlier. So I'm really excited about that. And the last thing I'll say before tossing it to you, Fitz, I think the questions about the offensive line are overblown. The Ravens as an organization, they often have questions at offensive line and they often figure it out. This is something that they have done year in and year out. Everybody's like, oh, they have this guy who was drafted in the 7th round who's never started a game. He's going to be their left guard, Andrew Voorhees. He was only a 7th rounder because of an injury. They were planning ahead for this eventuality. This is what the Ravens do. I'm not saying it's going to be the best offensive line in football. I think it'll be more than adequate and definitely a step up on what Henry had last year. So, everything to me, the arrow is so up on Henry in literally every category besides age. So I'm going to be willing to overlook that. Fitz, like I said, I know we talked about this on other shows before, but this is another area where our projections just like Henry better than ADP. What do you think?
Yeah, and the only real risk here, Worm, is age. Could he hit the wall now that he's on the wrong side of 30? It's entirely possible, but maybe some actuaries might not be willing to draft him for that reason. But I don't think anyone is shying away from Derrick Henry because they're concerned that it's going to be a timeshare with Justice Hill. So that's not the concern. And the funny thing is, Worm, we project him above his ADP, and yet our projection for his carries, 266, which I find entirely reasonable. That would actually be the second lowest number of rushing attempts for Derrick Henry since 2019. He's led the league in that category for the last 5 years. The only time he was below 266 was in, 2021 when he played 8 games and still had 219 carries.
Yeah, his carries per game that season were stupid. It was insane.
Insane, yes. If he plays 16 games, 266 projects to 16.6 carries a game. Entirely reasonable. And it's funny, Worm, I was on the 3 and Out podcast with our friend John Middlecoff yesterday from the Volume Network. And John was just talking about how it's hard to fathom what this is going to look like, as it's usually some sort of backfield by committee for the Ravens. Do you know what the highest number of rushing attempts in a season is for any running back during Lamar Jackson's 5 full seasons as a starter? Since, long delays for you to think about this would make for bad airtime, Worm, I'll give you 5 seconds on this. It's a hard one.
I don't know what the number would be. Would it be Mark Ingram?
It is Mark Ingram. Good job. 202 carries for Mark Ingram in 2019. 198 last year for Gus Edwards, and no other Ravens running back in the Lamar era has had 150 carries in a season. So it really has been a committee. It's interesting to imagine what this is going to look like with Derrick Henry most likely getting like well over 250 carries.
You know what's interesting too? Like, it really pains me to even remember it because I was really high on J.K. Dobbins coming into last season, and there was reports in the offseason about he's going to be like the every down player, even on third downs. And that first week started, he was getting all of the work, and then he obviously tore the Achilles. But that would have been interesting to see what his workload would have looked like if he played the entire season, because I think they were clearly committed to giving him 70% of the work. It was trending that way. Granted, it was only 1 week, but that 1 week you could clearly see the direction. So, and Ryan, you could probably attest to this more than I can. They've been linked to Derrick Henry for a little bit now, right? It's not like it's, oh, he's a finally free agent, let's make a push. There was trade rumors, etc.
Yeah, some of my friends who are, that I used to work in the area too, in addition to being a fan of the team, some of my sources close to the team told me that they were like very close to having a deal at the trade deadline just last year, and that there have been other years where they've tried it. Like this, he has been somebody that they've gone after before. Last question on Henry that I just want to ask you, Adam. If I guaranteed you health, if I said he is playing the entire season, what would you set the over-under at for touchdowns this year? Because I think the number is like ludicrously high.
15.
And I think that's the right number, and I think I would take the over. Like I just don't see. I can't imagine he's going to have many games where he doesn't get at least one. Like that is just the way this offense is built.
Like the last time we saw the Ravens play, it was them for whatever reason just clearly going away from the run against the Chiefs. I wonder if that's going to be part of their mindset too. It's like we need to get back to we have Derrick Henry, let's run the football, and their early down pass rate. It's actually interesting. Their early down pass rate in the first season with Todd Monken, it was at 57%. It was a top 7 rate in the league. I looked back, it was actually their highest rate in 15 years. So like they'll be a little bit more aggressive on early downs, but at the end of the day, the still the philosophy of this team is to run the football. And Fitz mentioned 16.6 per game as a projection. I think that's easily within reach.
Lamar Jackson is a walking top 5 rushing offense, and now you add in Derrick Henry. Like, I don't care that he's 30. I'm not overthinking it. This is going to be awesome. You mentioned the Chiefs game there. On the Chiefs side of things is the next running back that the projections love. And that's Isiah Pacheco. His ADP is RB12, 26th overall. Our projections have him as RB9. This is somebody that I have gotten more excited about as the offseason has gone along. We had Andy Behrens on the show several weeks ago, and he was like I think he had Pacheco like top 5 and was very effusive in his praise. And I'm starting to buy into that as well. Fitz, I'll start with you this time. Like I said, ADP RB12, but projections RB9. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and again, I think the projections are pretty reasonable. I don't think we're out over our skis in projecting 239 carries. He had 205 in 14 games last year. Then it went up to 20.3 carries a game in the Chiefs' 4 playoff games. Now, I would expect the Chiefs are probably going to exercise a little bit of load management here with Pacheco if he is going to be the clear primary back for them. But still, like, he is the lead guy. And I think our projection of 41 catches might even be conservative, considering he had 44 last year in 14 games. The one thing that maybe could throw a monkey wrench into that would be if they do re-sign Jerick McKinnon. But if they don't, like, there might be 60 catch upside here. But here's the one thing, Worm, that I get excited about with Pacheco and the projections. We have him projected for 8.5 touchdown runs. And last year he had 7 touchdown runs, but the team only scored 37 offensive touchdowns. That is a stark low number for the Chiefs during the Patrick Mahomes era. So 37 last year. The number of touchdowns they scored in Mahomes' other seasons as a starter, I'll start in 2022 and work backwards, 59, 53, 53, 46, 66. And last year they were down at 37. So if that number goes back to, 53, 54, where they've historically been during the Mahomes era, like, we could see Pacheco punch in 10, 12 touchdowns.
If Pacheco does really, I mean, like I said, ADP currently on our consensus, drawing from multiple sources, is 26th overall. If he does stay like there, he's an early 3rd round pick on a guy with this profile. I will be over the moon if I can pull that off in my leagues. Adam, where do you come down on Pacheco for this season?
Yeah, I actually just moved him up in my rankings yesterday. Andy Reid was talking him up on 3rd downs, and that's really what it's going to come down to for me, because last season Pacheco caught 1 pass in the 2-minute drill. On 3rd downs, you mentioned Jerick McKinnon, obviously. McKinnon was 8th among running backs with 15 catches on 3rd down. Pacheco only had, I believe, 4 catches on 3rd down. I think a huge reason behind the 44 receptions last season was just nobody was getting open for especially the first half of the season before they even really unlocked Rashee Rice. It was Mahomes was scrambling and checking it down a lot. I think Pacheco, with the weapons they added at receiver, is going to catch less passes on early downs. But if he fully takes over that third down role, yeah, like there's top 5 upside, especially if the touchdowns go back up like Fitz was talking about. Because last season he only played 17% of the snaps in the 2-minute drill. Long down and distances, it was 15%. Like Andy Reid was talking up a couple players, but he did mention that Pacheco can kind of do all the things. And if he's playing on third downs on top of getting the early down work, yeah, I don't think it would be really that surprising at all, especially if we think this Chiefs offense bounces back to being really, really good. I don't think it would shock me at all if he finished top 5. So I'm really excited to see him on third downs in the 2-minute drill. If he gets that role, there's really not a ceiling for him.
Fitz, what do you think about the ceiling? Is Pacheco to you more of a guy that there's a reasonable degree of certainty he's going to be like at least a back-end RB1 and that's appealing? Or do you see him as like, hey, this guy could be RB3 and it wouldn't shock you?
Right now it's floor because there's just no one to challenge him there. You know, Derrick Prince is challenging CEH, Clyde Edwards-Helaire for the backup job, but like Derrick Prince is not ready to push Isiah Pacheco for playing time. So it is going to be a healthy dose of Pacheco, even if they do sign McKinnon. Yeah, like he'd lose third down work, but man, he is just going to own first and second down.
Most of the guys in this range, in that top 50 and overall half PPR ADP, the running backs kind of do align with the projections versus ADP. So those are the only 2 running backs I have here. I've got a couple of receivers, though. I want to talk about Deebo Samuel. This obviously could change kind of how we approach this, depending on what resolution there is with Brandon Ayuk. As of the time we're recording this, there's not an official resolution, but it seems like things are trending in that direction of him being moved. So, take that with a grain of salt if that kind of situation does change. As of right now, the way things are currently set up, and you can weigh in the potential Ayuk trade however much you'd like, Adam. Either you're assuming it'll happen or you're not going to assume it happens until it does. Whatever you want to do with this. The projections for Deebo Samuel are wide receiver 9. ADP is wide receiver 13. 27th overall. So what do you make of that disparity? Again, weighing Ayuk however much you want to.
Yeah, if Ayuk is somehow there, I'm definitely lower on Deebo than wide receiver 9. But if Ayuk gets traded, and I'm starting to kind of lean that way with all the reports we're seeing, yeah, there's a chance that's even too low. Just because we know Deebo is getting 4 to 6 rushing touchdowns and 45, 50 rushing attempts, whatever he's going to get, and smaller sample size. But you look at just last season, according to FTN data, Deebo Samuel with Brandon Ayuk on the field, his target share was 17.6%, and the plays where Brandon Ayuk was off the field, it was over 24%. So we know that there's often games where one of Deebo or Kittle or Ayuk kind of disappear because it's tough for everybody to kind of eat. But I don't know if Ricky Pearsall steps in without Ayuk and all of a sudden it's the same thing. I think it'd be a little bit even more concentrated between Kittle, Deebo, and Ayuk. So yeah, it's kind of a wait and see for me with Deebo, but like especially if you're doing like best ball drafts right now, maybe the plan is to just draft Deebo where he's going, and it could just end up being a massive value because if Brandon Ayuk gets traded, I mean, Deebo Samuel is easy second round selection in most drafts.
Yeah, I've been very disinterested in Deebo this offseason. Again, assuming Ayuk was going to be
so
there.
Have I. And now I'm starting to be like, I probably should be at least a little more interested now.
Maybe it was a mistake. Yeah, I mean, if you look not at our expert consensus rankings across the industry, but just our staff rankings with Deebo, Erickson, Fitz, and Joey P., Deebo is 25th, 26th, 17th, and 20th at wide receiver. So we're even lower than consensus on him. But again, that's without this potential Ayuk trade. And by the way, if Ayuk gets traded to the Browns and they get Amari Cooper back, well, that's still another mouth to feed. It's not like that it would have to be Pearsall filling that role. I know with the Patriots, I think they said it was Kendrick Bourne would be coming back, so maybe that is a little more appealing if you're a Deebo manager. But if Amari Cooper comes back, like he could still be a big, target earner, I think. So I say all that to say, Fitz, you are lower than Deebo right now as it stands than consensus. How much would that change if Ayuk is moved? And again, the projections have Deebo pretty high, even with Ayuk not being moved.
It wouldn't change a lot if Amari Cooper was coming back. It would change a lot if Kendrick Bourne was coming back. If it was Kendrick Bourne, then all of a sudden for me, Deebo goes into that range where I think right now my wide receiver 9, 10, and 11, those guys for me are Marvin Harrison, Devontae Adams, and Drake London. I think I'm probably drafting Deebo ahead of all three of those guys if he's there in the featured receiver and it's only Kendrick Bourne coming back to the 49ers. I mean, he's a hard guy to project anyway because he's averaged 6.8 targets a game over the last 4 years, but sometimes he gets these spikes in rushing usage. Maybe not so much anymore with Christian McCaffrey there, but he's also pretty hard to project in terms of like yards per catch and average depth of target. His average depth of target the last few years has ranged from 2.2, where it's just basically screen passes and nothing else to Deebo, to 8.4. He's gone from like 11 yards per carry, ranging all the way up to 18 something. Like he's kind of been all over the place. But man, like if he is clearly the number one receiver here, and obviously they're going to throw to George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey too, but if we can guarantee a target count over like 110, man, I mean, like we know this guy's magic with the ball in his hands. Like put the ball in his hands more often, and I'm definitely interested.
For me personally, if it is Bourne coming back and not a situation where they get Amari, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson. For me personally, those 7 names are the only guys I am 100% sure I would still have ahead of Deebo. Even like Puka, I would consider that like going back and forth, given some of his injury stuff in college. He's already banged up now a bit in August. You know, Cooper Kupp might be healthier. You know, you already mentioned like Marvin Harrison, Devontae Adams, those guys. Like I could justify it as high as wide receiver 8, I think, if he is the clear alpha, at least among the wide receivers in this offense. So he might be somebody that we look back and have felt like we're very wrong on. Again, the situation would have changed in that scenario, I think. Let's go to the other wide receiver here. That's Mike Evans. This is a bigger gap here. Wide receiver 16 in ADP, 33rd overall, so back end of the 3rd round. Projections have him as wide receiver 10. He's somebody who's been so reliable year in and year out. Obviously, he's famous for always gets you 1,000 yards. You know, obviously he benefited from Baker Mayfield kind of being rejuvenated by Dave Canales. Canales is now gone. What does that mean? Does Chris Godwin bounce back? He's a really interesting player where, similar to Deebo, I haven't been that interested in Mike Evans this offseason, but it's more just I am excited about some of the young guys I can get in this range rather than being like, if I'm sitting down and thinking, oh, I am actively down on Mike Evans. But wide receiver 10 seems a little aggressive. Adam, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a little high for me, and it's really not against Mike Evans. I'm also just higher on Chris Godwin this season, so naturally I won't have Mike Evans pushing top 10 status. Godwin going back to the slot where both of his touchdowns came last season. He was more efficient, like 2-point-something yards per out run out of the slot. And like I know he's not a massive touchdown scorer, but if you're giving Chris Godwin 130 targets again, he's scoring more than 2 touchdowns. And he also led this team. He was top 5 in the NFL in 3rd down targets. So like when they needed a 1st down, Mayfield was throwing to him. Now, is Mike Evans getting his 1,008? Probably. And he was still really efficient. Like even on, you look at the FTN data on go and post routes, he was top 10 in EPA per target. Like he's still very, very good. For me, like when you're drafting a veteran wide receiver in that range, I'll just take the guaranteed volume that Devontae Adams is going to see. And then I also would lean towards some of the young upside players, Chris Olave, Drake London, Marvin Harrison. But I have no problem drafting Mike Evans. I have him a little bit lower than wide receiver 10.
What do you think, Fitz? What do you think is kind of driving the projections to being as high on Evans as they are?
Oh, just that he is a metronome of production, and you can count on 1,100 yards pretty much every year. So I totally get it. And, I have no issues with it. I just drafted him in Razzball. Shout out to our friends at Razzball for the invitation to that. But one thing I've been thinking about with regard to like the target distribution with the Buccaneers, and Adam just mentioned Godwin and his move back to the slot, which I do think bodes really well for him. But we've also got rookie Jalen McMillan just reportedly tearing it up in Bucs camp right now. Like he is having an eye-opening training camp by all accounts. And some of us at FantasyPros, namely Debro and myself, thought he was the better prospect than Jalen Polk, who was an early 2nd-round pick, whereas McMillan was a late 3rd-round pick. And back in 2022, before McMillan ran into some injury problems, he actually had more catches and more touchdowns than Rome Odunze that year, and I think only like 47 fewer receiving yards. So McMillan is really good, and if he asserts himself as like a wide a third receiver who actually matters for the Buccaneers, unlike Trey Palmer, who just, showed up with the occasional reception here and there last year. Because it's been a really skinny target tree with the Buccaneers. It's been Evans, Godwin, and whoever's at running back. But now if you throw McMillan into that mix, I know it would probably just be incremental damage to the target share of Evans and Godwin, but still incremental could drop him from being a top 10 guy to maybe wide receiver 16, wide receiver 17, and maybe he's not living up to the ADP. Well, not living up to our projections, and maybe is kind of living up to what the ADP currently is. So that's a little bit of a concern. It might, be a tiebreaker for me if I'm considering Mike Evans in drafts in the coming weeks.
So if you come away from your draft, you finish the third round, and you just took Mike Evans in the back half of the third round, Fitz, what is your mindset? Are you feeling like, oh, nice, I just got a guy who's a metronome of consistency in the back end of the third round? Or are you thinking there's some downside here, he's getting older, I might regret not taking kind of one of these young up-and-comers instead, or taking an early tight end or whatever? What's your mindset after taking Evans in the second half of the third round?
I'm still feeling pretty good because he used to routinely be a late second rounder. The production hasn't really changed, and I think he's going to age pretty well because he doesn't really rely on his ability to separate. He's just an above-the-rim guy, and I don't think that's going to change. He is a contested catch artist, and, unless he starts to shrink with age and get shorter, I'm not too worried about it.
I want to give everybody a quick note on DraftKings. You know the beautiful thing about being a sports fan? There's only 2 days the whole year without a game. Just 2. With so much happening and so much action, that makes just about every day game day at DraftKings Sportsbook. It's super easy for first-timers to get started. Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your team, and place your first bet. It really couldn't be any easier or any simpler. Baseball, golf, UFC, there's something for every fan of every sport to bet on at DraftKings. And of course, training camps are underway. Preseason is here. Football season is basically back too. So if you are new to DraftKings, you got to check this out. New customers bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code FantasyPros. That's code FantasyPros for new customers to get $150 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5 only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. All right, guys, let's go to, as we're designating, the breakouts that our projections love. These are players between 51 and 100th overall in half PPR ADP. We will start with George Pickens. He's just in this range. He's at 52nd overall, so just misses being in the first round. Of what we're talking about here. ADP is wide receiver 27, projections wide receiver 20. So well into that wide receiver 2 range, according to the projections. Adam, where do you have Pickens this year?
I mean, do we want to play the Brendan Ayuk game again?
Yeah, it's a good point.
That's part of it.
Yeah, let's assume no Ayuk in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I think he's a very logical breakout candidate. Obviously, you saw some of those signs in the first 4 weeks of the season last year where Deontay Johnson was out. Weeks 2 to 6, George Pickens, 97% of routes he ran a dropbacks he ran a route on. 29% target share, 25% target per route run rate. He averaged 8.3 targets, 4.5 receptions, 89 receiving yards, and 16.6 PPR points per game. And we finally started to see, once they moved on from Matt Canada, a lot more different routes from George Pickens. In the past, it was 30% of the time he was just running go routes. And it started to change a little bit. I'm expecting that to change even more so with Arthur Smith, who has historically loved to, utilize the middle of the field. And don't get me wrong, George Pickens will still be towards the top of the league in deep routes and go routes. And I actually think whether it's Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, both quarterbacks are good at throwing the deep ball and they want to throw the deep ball. So whether he gets schemed up more touches and targets in the middle of the field, that's good, but he'll still get the deep targets too. And really, he's competing with Pat Freiermuth and Jalen Warren for targets. That's about it right now. So I'm really excited about him. Having 1,000 yards despite having all the different quarterback situations last season is impressive. He wins at the highest levels of the field and against top tier defensive backs in coverage. So yeah, and now going into this season, I think there's no reason to not be excited.
If, just for the sake of argument, it seems like from the reporting that Ayuk is not going to be going to Pittsburgh, but if he were, how much would your evaluation of Pickens change?
Yeah, he would probably move down. Right now he's in the tier of Zay Flowers and some of those guys. He would probably move closer to back end wide receiver 20, high end, like low 30s for me probably. Just because we've seen Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk's essentially been at his peak a better, more efficient by a lot, but just a flat out better version of Deontay Johnson almost. So he'd be playing with like a better version of Deontay Johnson, a much better version of Deontay Johnson again, who is still in his prime. So that would definitely hurt him. And it's still going to be a team that's probably, like you look at Arthur Smith last season, the reason George Pickens adding a talented wide receiver is really scary is because Arthur Smith last season, top 5 in neutral script rush rate. They also ran the ball at the second highest rate in the NFL when they were trailing by 8+ points. So they don't care, especially with that defense. Like, this is still going to be a team that runs first and runs second.
Fitz, let's operate under the assumption that Ayuk is not in Pittsburgh. What do you think of this disparity between where we have Pickens projected versus where his ADP is? And, while his ADP is lower at the position, wide receiver 27 versus wide receiver 20, he is still going in like the early part of the 5th round overall. So it's not like people are down on him in terms of what drafts are looking like, but there is still, like I said, a gap there among the position.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a little lower than our projections and more in line with ADP. I think I've got him like wide receiver 24, 25. And I guess I'm a little torn here. I do think he's kind of in that Mike Evans phylum as like not a great separator, but just this crazy good contested catch artist. And maybe that was the reason why he wasn't always getting the sort of targets you thought he should for a guy with that level of talent. Like Adam mentioned, 8.3 targets a game without Deontay Johnson early last season when Deontay was on IR with that hamstring injury. But otherwise, 5.6 targets a game for his career. I do think, we could blame Canada for that. And, like maybe things are going to get a little better and it's not just going to be all go routes. But I do also wonder if Arthur Smith is the guy to get the targets we think George Pickens should be get. Like I thought Drake London was going to be a wash in targets last year with what else they had on the roster wide receiver. Drake London was 29th in the league in targets last year with 110. And that is considering that number 2 in the Falcons in targets among wide receivers, Mac Hollins with 30. 30. And yet Drake London only had 110 targets. So I don't know if Arthur Smith is going to be any sort of panacea for George Pickens as far as unlocking him and making him one of the most targeted guys in the league. But this is still a guy who can do quite a bit of damage, like even on kind of a modest target count. So if there's no Ayuk injury, no Ayuk trade, I'm cautiously optimistic that George Pickens has like kind of a semi-breakout season here.
I kind of want to cut that clip of Fitz saying, like, we could always just blame Canada and just share that without context. He starts to try and start some beef with our neighbors to the north. But
that's a reference, right? The South Park movie. You've got to know that.
Yes,
you live in Denver, Worm. I mean, you have to.
I'm not actually like a big South Park guy, but I've seen enough to understand that reference.
Okay, good.
But it's just a funny thing without context. All right, let's move on to the quarterback that we have to talk about in this section. That's Dak Prescott, ADP 73rd overall, QB9. Our projections have him QB5. He was really good last year. The situation isn't all too different than it was last year. He was like an MVP candidate late in the season before he had his fall apart game, and then that kind of elevated Brock Purdy and then Leslie Lamar into that favorite role. But Dak was really good last year. QB5, like I said, 4 spots higher at the position than ADP, going 73rd overall. Fitz, I'll start with you here. Do you think Dak, QB5 is not where you need to draft him. Do you see that upside case though?
Oh, I do. He's 7 or 8 for me, I think, and I'm still above consensus with him there. I think one of the better pure passers in the league. Like Mahomes is like on a level by himself, and then I think Prescott isn't in the conversation for being up near the top of tier 2. Led all quarterbacks in TD passes last year, 36, completions 410. In 2023, also ranked 2nd in completion percentage, 2nd in passer rating, 6th in yards per attempt. I think he's tied for 6th among active quarterbacks in yards per attempt. So he's been doing this for a long time. I think he's terrific, and it's hard to see the Cowboys leaning heavily on the run this year when they have one of the sketchiest running back groups in the league.
Where do you have Dak ranked, Adam?
Yeah, he's around that same range for me, like 8. What's interesting to me, like you mentioned, in the second half of the season, he was the best quarterback in the league. From week 8 on, 36.5 pass attempts, 290 passing yards, 2.7 passing touchdowns, and 23.6 fantasy points per game. During that span, 7 top 8 finishes, 6 inside the top 3. For me, like, Dak Prescott comfortably, wasn't even close, led the NFL with 67 end zone passes last season. Like, Tony Pollard, I had him on one of my most important teams. I was well aware that he could not convert touchdowns. He had 13 carries inside the 5, scored 3 times. That helped the touchdowns, I think. And like, I wonder if Zeke is actually better in that role, if they convert more touchdowns. But also, like, they might just not be able to run the ball well. I know Rico Dowdle's been impressing in camp, but right now, the offense hasn't really changed other than the fact that their run game might actually be worse. Last year, Dallas actually was 4th in early down pass rate at 59%. I just think, like, there's not 3 to 4 quarterbacks you would project for more passing attempts this season than Dak. Would I love if they had a reliable second option after CeeDee Lamb? I like Jake Ferguson. But yeah, I think the top 5 upside might be hard just because you're not getting a ton of rushing production. But the weekly floor with the volume he should see is going to be really high. It just comes down to, like, will Dallas be able to actually convert goal line carries into touchdowns? Because if they can again, then Dak's going to be really, really good once again. Still be good regardless, but that's kind of what I'm keeping an eye on for Dallas.
In ECR right now, the 3 names ahead of Dak at the position, so QB6, CJ Stroud, QB7, Kyler Murray, QB8, Joe Burrow, Dak is QB9. Again, this is in ECR. And then behind him, QB10 is Jordan Love, QB11 is Brock Purdy, QB12 is Jaden Daniels. Is this the right spot for Dak to be behind Stroud, Kyler, and Burrow and ahead of Love, Purdy, and Daniels? Because I kind of feel like I might rather have Dak than Burrow, given kind of the injury stuff we saw last year. I probably wouldn't take him ahead of Stroud or Murray. And then guys like Love, maybe Daniels, just all in on the rushing, I might consider ahead of him. But I guess it's probably the right range, even if I would flip some of those names from ahead of him to behind him. What do you think about that, Adam? Is that the right spot for him?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have it ranked this way, but, like, you're banking on similar things with Stroud and Dak. Just a ton of passing volume. Obviously, Stroud is the better supporting cast, but, like, where Stroud goes in drafts, like, I think waiting just a few rounds later to get Prescott is probably better. But other than that, I slightly have Burrow ahead of him. I do have Kyler ahead of him. But I do have him ahead of the other guys you mentioned, like Jordan Love and Brock Purdy, etc. But yeah, I think, like, Stroud's somebody I just haven't been drafting, so maybe that's why I'm kind of staking this stance. But you're banking on similar things in volume and just sheer, like, 4,500 type passing yards and 35 to 40 passing touchdowns if you're drafting Dak and Stroud. So why not just draft Dak later?
I think
actually,
totally
Dak's probably going to
legitimate.
throw more anyway, because even with the weapons I guess they added weapons with Mixon and Diggs. Bobby Slowick still wants to run the ball in early downs. Dak is probably going to throw more than Stroud, so.
Yeah, I think that's totally legitimate. Of the names I mentioned, I think Kyler's the only one that, like, very definitively, no doubt about it, I am taking ahead of Dak. I think the others, like, you could make the case for him as, higher than those other guys. Fitz, what do you think? Again, it's Stroud, Kyler, and Burrow's ahead of him. Love, Purdy, and Jaden Daniels behind him.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I have it too. I do have Dak ahead of Burrow, but I consider that almost a coin flip.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Let's go to Calvin Ridley, wide receiver here. He's wide receiver 30 in projections, down at wide receiver 38 in ADP. So an 8-spot gap there. 78th overall in ADP, obviously on a new team here. I don't really know what to expect from Will Levis this season, but, theoretically could take a step forward and, has the arm talent to maybe lead to a lucrative season for Calvin Ridley going as a wide receiver 4 right now. Adam, what do you make of Ridley and that gap from ADP wide receiver 38 up to wide receiver 30 in our projections?
Yeah, I mean, also is the interesting aspect of DeAndre Hopkins. Will he be ready for week 1? When he joined the team, Ridley, like, Brian Callahan was talking about how they're going to kind of use him similar to the way they used Jamar Chase in Cincinnati. I don't quite envision that, but remember the start of last season in Jacksonville, they were just kind of lining up on the outside, far away from the line of scrimmage, like super close to the sideline, and just saying, okay, go win against press coverage, and then everything else was schemed for Kirk and for Ingram. I don't think that's going to be the same with Callahan. I think there's going to be way more consistency with Calvin Ridley. They're obviously going to throw the ball more than they really have in, like, a decade at least in Tennessee. And Will Levis, like, gives you upside because he just throws the ball down the field a ton. Like, he led the NFL in percentage of passes of 20-plus yards. It was 22.5% of his passing attempts went for 20-plus yards. It's why DeAndre Hopkins was among the top receivers in the league in deep targets. And had a lot of upside on a per target basis. I don't think that's changing for Will Levis. So you add that. Ridley is, maybe he gets a few games to start the season, even if it's only 1-2, like you're probably getting like a 25 to 30% target share in those games without Hopkins. So Ridley was starting to get my attention a little bit more before the Hopkins injury, and now obviously I did move him up a few spots since it looks like he could miss week 1 at the very least.
Fitz, it looks like you are lower than our projections on Ridley, but higher than ADP, so kind of falling in the middle here.
Yeah, and so much depends on Will Levis here. Like, we have a perfectly reasonable set of median projections for Ridley. 68 catches, 931 yards, 6.8 touchdowns. Like, if you were to force me to do projections, that's probably right around where I would come in for Calvin Ridley. But, man, Levis could totally shift these projections either way, like if he's a pleasant surprise or if he's a complete train wreck. But to sort of piggyback on something that Adam said, like at least Levis throws the ball downfield aggressively. So if he is going to be a disaster, you hope he is a Nick Mullins style disaster, where at least he's throwing the ball aggressively downfield and you're still feeling comfortable starting wide receivers and tight ends who are attached to him just because he's so fearless in taking chances. Now, he might throw 30 interceptions doing that, but, at least he's going to...
That's fine. Hopefully they get ran back and he gets the ball right back.
Exactly. So, I just don't know. He's been kind of a guy I'm drafting around so far. Like, I don't know if I've drafted Calvin Ridley yet other than like in a couple summer best balls. I don't know if I've got him on any of my managed teams yet, and I've done like maybe 5 of those drafts so far. But I should probably get a little bit of Calvin Ridley just in case Will Levis hits.
We talked about this on one of our kind of macro level strategies shows, Fitz, about like I try to enter drafts not thinking of like my exposure on players and
portfolios.
Trying to think of if this was my only team, would I want this guy or not? And I feel like Calvin Ridley, like if he was my wide receiver 3, I think I would be nervous about that. I'd be a lot more comfortable if he was my wide receiver 4. I mean, is that a fair assessment, you think, Adam?
Yeah. Like, there was a stretch where like he was just flat out getting outplayed by Christian Kirk last season. So like it's not crazy to believe that once Hopkins is good to go, like Ridley's getting the second most targets on the team. And I'm also really high in Tajay Spears. And like what if this defense is better too? Like they added a lot of pieces on defense, so there's still a lot of question marks with Calvin Ridley, but there's still a part of those question marks. A, it's already kind of baked into his ADP in certain spots, and B, there's still upside there. So it'd be way less appealing if there was all these question marks and there wasn't even that much of a payoff if it hit. But I do think there is a payoff because Will Levis can be that high upside quarterback for the wide receivers he's throwing the football to. And we know Calvin Ridley's still a really talented player.
Oh, and by the way, the thing about like if DeAndre Hopkins does miss a game or two, I don't know if that makes me that much more inclined to want to play Calvin Ridley in the first couple of weeks. Because like last year, there was this really weird dynamic on the Jaguars where
Zay Jones
would miss time and you would think that was going to funnel extra targets to Ridley, but like Ridley would tank in the games where Zay Jones was hurt. And then Zay would come back and Ridley would have good games. I think
it was because like when they didn't have Zay Jones, they said, okay, we're not even going to play any 3 wide sets. And when they were playing 3 wide sets, like Ridley had a chance to move around the formation. And then when they were in just 2 receiver sets, like Ridley was just not moving. So he was just getting those targets that were low percentage. But he also had a weird season where he left a lot of fantasy points on the table. Like he led the NFL with 24 end zone targets, but had a couple that he dropped, a couple where his foot couldn't get down. Like it was a really weird season from him last season too. So I wonder if they get similar red zone usage, which would obviously be great.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean the Jags famously like had so many near misses last year. So yeah, we'll see how it goes this year. Adam, let's start with you because you kind of already mentioned a bit what you're thinking about Jake Ferguson when we talked about Dak Prescott. He is the next guy here. ADP tight end 11, 89th overall. Projections have him tight end 8. I think there's a pretty clear top 7 for most people this season, and who that tight end 8 could be, is kind of more personal preference, and you'll see different, analysts have different guys in that spot. For our projections, it's Ferguson. What do you think about him being right outside that top 7?
My plan at tight end is pretty simple this season. If I would love to get one of the top 5, 6 tight ends. If I don't, I want to draft Jake Ferguson. And if I don't get him, I'll draft Pat Freiermuth and pray, pretty much. Ferguson, like obviously you want tight ends if you're going to, the outside the top 7, you're looking for tight ends that have a chance to be first or second on their team in targets. Ferguson's done that. He was second last year with just over 100, and run a ton of routes. He did that. He ran a route on 76% of dropbacks. And I mentioned all the end zone throws from Dak Prescott. A lot of them went to Jake Ferguson. Ferguson last year, 12 targets inside the 10-yard line. That was top 3, or that was top among all tight ends. And then he was top 3 in end zone targets with 9. I just don't see a scenario. Like, he had 5 touchdowns last year. I think that could be his floor, especially if they don't have any semblance of a run game again, especially at the goal line. So, yeah, my plan is simple. Try to get an elite tight end. If I don't, I am more than happy to draft Jake Ferguson. And, like, the volume was still solid, too. Like, just over 100 targets. Like, I think he can get that again.
I know sometimes these shows are more fun when we are like vehemently disagreeing with each other. That is my exact strategy at tight end. I want one of those top half dozen guys. If I'm taking a mid-round guy, it's Ferguson. And if I'm waiting later, it's Freiermuth. I could not agree more with exactly what you just laid out as far as the strategy goes. Fitz, when it comes to Ferguson specifically, obviously, as a Wisconsin guy, we don't need to sell you on him, the player. Do you think tight end 8 is an appropriate ranking for him?
I do. I think I'm a little bit lower, and I don't quite share the same strategy with you guys because I'm also really high on Brock Bowers. So he's another weight on tight end option for me. But I totally agree with what Adam is talking about with the touchdown upside for Ferguson. He had 5 last year. Our projections say 6, but he led all tight ends with 25 red zone targets and had a 22.1% red zone target share. So like 6 might be a conservative estimate. Like he could easily score 7 or 8.
Let's go to Brian Robinson here, the last guy kind of in this 51 to 100 range. He's 96th overall, RB33. Projections have him up at RB28. This is somebody that some of the folks here at Fantasy Pros, Deebo, I know, is very excited about Brian Robinson this season. I know that's become something of a popular sentiment, amongst rankers everywhere. And, the comparison that I keep seeing made, and I've made myself, is we saw RG3 and Alfred Morris, 12 years ago in DC, and now that we could be seeing that 2.0 version with Jaden Daniels and Brian Robinson here. That's the upside case, at least. Fitz, do you think Brian Robinson is going to be closer to that projections, up in the 20s, or closer to his ADP in the 30s?
Yeah, I mean, I'm even above the projection. I think I've got him in the mid 20s too. And yes, I am envisioning that Alfred Morris rookie season where he went ballistic with the mobile RG3 worm. And granted, Austin Eckler is a bit of a wild card here, but Eckler did look pretty cooked last year. And if Robinson gets a clear majority of the early down snaps, and if Jaden Daniels adapts pretty smoothly to the NFL, like Robinson could just blow by our projections, which say like 762 rushing yards, 5.3 touchdowns. Daniels' rushing ability could really open things up for Robinson, give him high-level rushing efficiency, and give him increased touchdown potential.
Our staff rankings have him up at RB23. So even, across the board, it's not just you, Deebo, Erickson, Joe are all higher on Robinson than even the projections are giving him. ECR across the industry is more in line with those projections. Adam, where do you have Robinson ranked?
Yeah, he's towards the back end of like the high 20s, low 30s for me. It is interesting because he was actually pretty efficient as a pass catching running back last season. Now, will that be part of his role? Maybe a little bit, but not a massive extent with Eckler there. And the other thing that you have to love, Brian Robinson himself has talked about it a ton when asked, like the pace that they're playing at in Washington with this Cliff Kingsbury offense is insane. Like obviously in 2019 through 2021, Cliff was the head coach and play caller in Arizona. During that stretch, the Cardinals easily led the NFL with a 35.5% no-huddle rate. So that's going to be great for play volume. I will say I was at Washington's camp last week. He's not going to be the consensus first-round fantasy player he once was, but Austin Eckler looked a lot more explosive, and I think it's newsflash, he's healthy. It's duh. But he had a nice little jump cut run. He looked a lot more explosive. So I definitely don't think Eckler's done, but I do think at the very least Brian Robinson's the 1A in an ascending offense, and I do think the efficiency will be good. So in a lot of the drafts where I like to go 0 RB or hero RB, Robinson's a really, really high target for me.
Yeah, Robinson feels to me like somebody where I'm comfortable if I am really strong elsewhere on the roster with him as my RB2, but I'm really excited if he's my RB3 in terms of how I'm approaching that position. All right, we will wrap things up with the sleepers that our projections love. These are just guys going outside the top 100 in overall half PPR ADP. We've got 3 names for you here. We'll start with the running back, Gus Edwards, 117th overall, RB41 in ADP. Projections have him up at RB32. This to me is a very interesting conversation because you have to kind of get it right, what's going on with this backfield, right? There's been recent hype on J.K. Dobbins, which we've had in previous years, and I've been, at the head of that and have loved Dobbins basically every year that he's entered camp healthy, and I'm kind of buying back in at cost. Gus Edwards, though, was really good last year. Over 1,000 combined yards, rushing and receiving, 13 touchdowns. Like, that's a very strong season, and now he's in an offense where we know they like to run the ball. Herbert is now kind of banged up. I get the case for Edwards. I also like the case for Dobbins. I like the case for Kamani Vidal. Kind of hard to make that decision. The one that our projections like the most, though, is definitely Gus Edwards here. So, Adam, of those 3, and then specifically, what do you think about Gus Edwards? Do you think this is kind of the right direction to be leaning? I mean, for me personally, I'll just say my goal is to kind of just take as many swings on this backfield as I can in various drafts and trust that one of them is going to be the guy that turns into something of a league winner. What do you think about Gus Edwards in that position?
Yeah, it's totally fair. And I think it kind of depends on how you view the Chargers as a team, right? If you think they'll be better than expected, then you should have more interest, especially in Gus Edwards. For me, though, and one of the talk, they've kind of been like the most polarizing team in fantasy, right? Everybody wants to know what to do with the wide receivers and the backfield. For me, though, everybody's saying Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, they're going to run the ball 50 times per game. And yes, obviously at their core, that's what these two have wanted to do in many stops, right? Obviously Harbaugh with Michigan, and both when they were in San Francisco, and then Roman in Baltimore and back in Buffalo. The difference is those teams had the personnel to be as run heavy as they were. They had good defenses. They had good offensive lines. They had good players in the backfield. I don't know if the Chargers have any of that, right? The offensive line should be good with Alt and Slater. I don't think the defense is going to be great, and Bosa's already banged up again. And if they're chasing points in the AFC, are they really going to be able to be as run heavy as we all think? So for me, I have no problem taking, shots on the backfield, especially whoever goes the latest. I think it's at the end of the day, players will move around by the end of the month, but it'll still be Gus Edwards going first. I'm just a little bit lower on this backfield just because if they're a bad team, what's the real upside, especially if Edwards is playing first and second down, or he's just straight up splitting work with Dobbins on early downs, and then somebody else is playing third downs. I was higher on Edwards to start the offseason. I've definitely moved off him a little bit since.
Fitz, I think this is another one where you kind of come in with your personal ranking is between projections and ADP, right?
Yeah. And unlike Adam, I'm not that concerned about them being run heavy because I think under Greg Roman, the least run heavy team he's had was 11th in rushing rates. So that was a wild, wide open season for Greg Roman, and they were still pretty tilted toward the run. It's just that for me, Gus Edwards is sort of the walking avatar of the running back I don't like to draft, kind of the plodding early down grinder who doesn't catch passes, doesn't make a lot of big plays, but it's hard to deny that he is going to be in the mix in this running game as long as he's healthy and probably score a pretty good number of touchdowns. So, it's kind of like the vegetable you don't like to eat that is good for you. I guess for me, that'd be zucchini or squash or something. And I know I should be pushing the button on Gus Edwards in the 9th round or wherever he typically goes, but I can never bring myself to do it.
The other thing I will say on Gus, and I say this with a lot of love in my heart for his time in Baltimore, he was, a favorite in the city and, did a lot of good things for the Ravens. He played his whole career with Lamar Jackson, and that makes it really easy to be an efficient runner. He has one of the highest yards per carry of all time because he was in the backfield with Lamar Jackson for his entire career. I am curious to see what it looks like. We know that Greg Roman can scheme up a quality run game, so I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff or be terrible if he is the RB1 in this backfield. But Justin Herbert is not Lamar Jackson in terms of the threat he poses as a rusher. So I am curious to see what Gus's efficiency as he starts to get older. He has been, has the reputation of being a bit of a plotter and is now maybe not going to have the same kind of level of these huge openings open up because of the threat of, the option with Lamar. So it's just something I'm keeping an eye on and we'll be curious to see kind of how that pans out. Let's go to the last quarterback we're going to talk about here. That's Trevor Lawrence. His ADP is 122nd overall, QB 17. Projections are QB 12, and this is one that I'll just say I'm closer to the projections here. We talked about a bit with Calvin Ridley. There was a lot of near misses with this offense last year that could have made his season look a lot better. Obviously, like the talent, nobody's questioning in terms of just what he was as a prospect and the pedigree. I am buying it. I'm not going to take Lawrence over like a guy like Dak or somebody like that, but I definitely think he's going to be in that borderline QB1, maybe even with more ceiling to come beyond that. I like him a lot closer to QB 12 than QB 17, and he is one of the reasons where I am willing to wait on quarterback, because I love tier 3 this year, and he's at the back end of tier 3. To me, I'm very willing to wait and pass on some of these other guys and get Lawrence, just because I think the upside is really clear there. Fitz, where do you have Lawrence ranked this year?
I want to say I have him at QB 15, and yet he is one of the guys I would be perfectly comfortable with rolling into a season with him as my starter, assuming that I waited on quarterback and just pounded running back, receiver, and tight end in the rounds before that. We know his best season is yet to come. I mean, he's had an anemic 3.3% touchdown rate over his career. And like that's just ridiculously low. And his single season high in touchdown passes 25 2 years ago. It wouldn't surprise me if he spiked over 30 one of these years, and he's gone over 4,000 yards each of the last 2 years. So like the floor here is pretty safe, and I feel like there is a touchdown bonanza coming at some point. Maybe not like 40, but he could definitely get to 30, and runs a little bit too. So yeah, I feel perfectly fine drafting Trevor Lawrence after I've waited at the position and let everyone else take a starter first.
Yeah, the guys in this area that he's going in, Tua is a couple spots ahead of him. Caleb Williams, as a rookie, one spot ahead of him. Justin Herbert is in that range. Like, of those guys, Lawrence is the one that I would be the least surprised if we look up at the end of the year and he was like QB 6. And again, you don't have to draft him there. I think the ceiling is definitely there for a season where he much outperforms what this ADP is. Adam, where are you on Lawrence this year?
Yeah, so a couple weeks ago over on my podcast at FTN, I had my colleague Scott Spratt on, and we were talking about regression candidates, and he really made the case for Trevor Lawrence, and it really opened my eyes because of the touchdowns. Like Fitz talked about the crazy low touchdown rate. You look at last season alone, he only had 7 touchdown passes from inside the 10-yard line, and he completed less than 46% of his passes from inside the 10. Like all those Calvin Ridley drops, the out of bounds that was almost inbounds, but he just couldn't get the foot down. Like all of those just scream positive regression. Still a talented player. And yeah, like Doug Peterson and Press Taylor have called some design runs for him in the past too. So I still like the tier where it's like Goff and Purdy. And I think I still have 2 over him. But yeah, like you mentioned, like if he was a top 7 quarterback at the end of the season and that touchdown regression finally does hit, yeah, and I agree. Like, we definitely have not seen the best from Trevor Lawrence. He's been in some really tough circumstances in his career. And even, like, with Peterson and Press Taylor, they've kind of gone back and forth with play calling. If he can get some consistency, I still think there's good enough talent at wide receiver and et cetera. So, Lawrence is somebody I've been moving up over the last month or so.
Fitz, if I told you that he did have, you said his best season of his career is still ahead of him. If I told you that this ends up being it, he hits his ceiling this season, where would you think he lands? I mean, is it in the top 5? Is it in the top 3? Or is the ceiling, Steve, even if he finally kind of puts it all together from a fantasy perspective, still more like 8 or 9?
I don't think he's going to be top 3 because the rushing upside isn't quite what it is for guys like Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, even Jaden Daniels. But top 5 maybe, and top 10 for sure.
The last name we have here, Mike Williams, kind of a forgotten man, at least in my experience, and just looking at the conversation online, and has not been, a lot of the names we've talked about here today, Fitz, you and I have talked about on previous shows this year. I feel like Mike Williams' is a name basically hasn't really come up, but there is like a path here if he, is healthy. Obviously, the whole offense stays healthy. The projections have him up at wide receiver 47. ADP is down at wide receiver 64. So we're getting lower into the rankings here, but that's a fairly sizable gap. 41st, overall. By the way, again, wide receiver 47 is the projection. Adam, what do you make of Mike Williams this year? And he's somebody that you do see some ceiling with.
It's funny you mentioned how he's kind of been forgotten. I quite literally have not thought about Mike Williams really at all. I just think like we know that a Rodgers and Hackett led offense is going to be one of the slowest pace offenses in the NFL. We know that. I mean, look at last year. Like 48% of the targets went between Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. Like I don't even think Mike Williams will be third on the team in targets. I think that's going to be Tyler Conklin. So veteran coming off the ACL. Completely different offense than he was with the Chargers. Some of those Chargers teams are some of the most pass-happy offenses we've seen in the NFL. I would just rather, and he's going to have a more consistent kind of like in terms of playing time role than a lot of the rookies that go late and some of the breakouts that could be down there that go late. But I would rather just take the upside on somebody down where he's going, becoming a top 30 wide receiver and really earning a key role in their offense. And Mike Williams, if he was in a different offense, it'd be different, but this team is going to be so slow-paced, and all the targets and touches are going to Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. So Mike Williams, I hope he bounces back. Actually, I don't. I'm a Bills fan. I don't want the Jets doing well. But no, I hope he does bounce back. I'm just not really high on him in fantasy.
Yeah, I think the way I would put it as far as like kind of forgetting about him is like we talked about the portfolio fits earlier. Like if I end up this season and I look at all my teams and I have 0 Mike Williams on any of my teams, I might be like, okay, that could backfire, but I'm not going to feel FOMO, right? Like I'm not going to be like, oh, I missed out on Mike Williams as we enter the season. If he's not on any of my teams, he's not somebody that I'm going to
You might have missed out on the wide receiver 60 being finishing as like the wide receiver 45. Like that's not something you're like, oh boy.
It's not going to ruin this season. Yeah. Exactly. Fitz, where do you have Mike Williams ranked?
Yeah, I'm maybe in the 40s for him. And I do have him on a couple of best ball teams in the portfolio. But, as Adam pointed out, it's going to be a glacial pace under with Hackett and Rodgers. They always were bottom 3 in pace when they were together in Green Bay. Not only that, but the Jets defense projects to be one of the best in the league. So we're not going to see the Jets involved in a lot of shootouts. Yeah, Williams, if he stays reasonably healthy, is going to have some big plays, some splash plays. But like best ball, that's great. But do you trust him in a managed league, putting him in your starting lineup in any given week? I don't know. I mean, there's just, one catch for 12 yards is the floor, and I just don't want to deal with that. So I'm kind of drafting around him for the most part in my managed leagues.
If you want to check out more of our projections on the site, you can go to the homepage and then go to research and then hit projections and see where all the players are ranked across all the positions and kind of see where you might disagree as a listener. So I hope everybody goes and checks those out on FantasyPros.com. By the way, just because I'm anticipating people like to yell at me when I say I haven't seen a lot of something. I did go to Casa Bonita, even though I haven't seen a lot of South Park. I went there earlier this summer, so I hope that gives me some cred amongst the South Park fans. And it was a really fun time. I actually had a great experience going to eat there at the newly opened Casa Bonita that's out near me here in Denver. So that was super fun. We'll get out of there on that. Thank you so much again, Adam, for coming and joining us to chat today. I thought this was an awesome episode. Thank you, Fitz, as well. For Adam and Fitz, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.